everybody out there in Bourbon Real Talk land. Randy Sullivan coming to you today with a very special guest. We have Bernie Lubbers on Bourbon Real Talk, one of my favorite people in the whiskey industry. How are you doing today?
Hey, Randy, I'm doing just fine. Just out here in Kentucky, enjoying the winter here.
Yeah. You guys getting some snow?
Not yet, and then it's gotten a little cold, but it's not going too bad. But that whiskey's now moved out of those barrels, out of that wood into the barrels, and this is the time where they kind of sleep for the winter. So this is something real important for the whiskey.
Yeah, whiskey's there hibernating. Yeah, so for those of you who do not know, Bernie has been a major influence in the whiskey industry. He has been not single-handedly, but definitely the most vocal proponent of bottled and bond whiskeys. And his level of commitment to bottled and bond goes far beyond what, I don't know, it's definitely a passion. And it's always been impressive for me. So Bernie, tell the people, how did you get so passionately involved with the Bottled and Bond Act?
Well, Randy, I've been talking about bottled and bond since about 2006. So it's not anything that happened overnight. And you're right, it's not something that I did single-handedly for sure. I might be the lead Johnny Appleseed or Johnny Bottle and Bond Seed guy, but it takes a lot of folks and a lot of people getting what I did. I realized early. So I started in the industry in 2005. There were 10 distilleries in Kentucky at the time, making 95% of the world's bourbon. Today in 2020, there are 69 distilleries just in Kentucky, and there are 1,800 craft distillers around the United States that did not exist in 2005. Right. So 2005, I start with Jim Beam. And I'm somewhat of an ambassador, but really my job was, that would be being generous to call it an ambassador. I was doing events and promotions, although everywhere you go, you're an ambassador for your brand. So that's where I started. And that's where I was like, ooh, that's what I want to do though. I noticed that early on, but, so my job was to push the whiskeys here in Kentucky for Jim Beam. And I never forget, I went up to, spirits companies are phenomenal when they onboard you and they give you lots of training. The training's never enough, but it's what the average person needs to get on the street and start, hawking the brands and promoting the brands. And because Jim Beam, as well as, many companies, they have vodkas and rums and gins and tequilas and all kinds of things. Well, most people around the country had a budget for all those spirits. In Kentucky, because all those other spirits aren't as big as whiskey, I only had a budget for whiskey. And I was, was welcome to the company, like everybody else. There was 25 of us or so around the country. And we went up to Chicago, and a vice president came by to, welcome everyone and whatever. And he was like, "Oh, where are you located?" I said, "Well, I'm in Kentucky." He goes, "Oh, it's too bad. All you have is a budget for whiskey. Nobody's drinking that." So that's 2005. Wow. The world's largest bourbon company. A guy's apologizing to me because I'm representing just the whiskeys. Right. Because back then it was all vodka, right? Right. And tequila's big too, but still vodka was driving the train. So I got to, I've been real fortunate in my career. I've been able to work with some of the, legends of the industry. So I was working with Fred Noe over at Jim Beam there. And I noticed, quickly noticed, ooh, that's the kind of job I want. Although I'm not a family member, so I'm sure I'll never get to do something like this. Right. But I was just like, I noticed, I was like, that's going to be my goal, is to somehow show my passion for bourbon, because I was just a regular guy who just drank, grew up drinking whiskey, but I wasn't an expert. I just got in the industry. But I noticed that Fred had a lot of stories, of course, being a member of the Beam family, and Fred Noe, Booker's son, and Jim Beam's great grandson. He had a lot of stories. Right. And I'm thinking, well, gosh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And at the time, Jerry Dalton was the master distiller there. Fred was learning more about distilling, and actually, Jerry was the one over the distilleries. And I remember having a meeting with him, and he handed me, and I've got a copy of him right here. I'm highlighting. He said, have you ever seen the Standards of Identity? And I said, no, sir. And he goes, well, if you don't know this, you don't know shit.
Okay.
And ever since that day, I've carried these around with me wherever I go in the world.
I can testify to that. I have gone to dinner with him. He had his briefcase and he got them out and showed them.
And he's right, because there's so many laws, and they're written, to be interpreted by lawyers and distilleries. So you could read it and have one interpretation, but also there's no question them. And because we are regulated by the United States government, when somebody says, hey, I have a question about this or a question about bottle, I can just pull them out and we can read it together.
Right.
Because, a lot of people will say, oh, no, you're wrong, and they'll believe whatever their father said or grandfather. Oh, no, bourbon has to be made in Kentucky. You can't make it anywhere else. I'm like, well, wait, let's read the law,
Right.
So, and then the law tells you. So I started to, through different brands. And then I had, then I was like, there's a brand here, it was at Jim Beam. And it was one of my first favorite bourbons I ever found on my own back in the 1980s. And old Granddad Bottle and Bond. And I'm like, oh man, that's cool. I mean, I can kind of take that brand under my wing, but I didn't have a budget for that whiskey, because you get a budget for certain brands, and I didn't know how the thing worked, and so you get money from Jim Beam and Knob Creek, but they don't want you talking about their other whiskeys because that's what their budget is,
right.
That's what their budget's for. But I would always hit those, and then I would talk about other whiskeys too in the portfolio. And then sometimes, and I was like, ooh, the words bottle and bond, bonded. So I started asking about that, and I was like, this is such a fascinating, it's got its own, bourbon has this little paragraph. Yeah.
Right.
And so that's bourbon, it's real important, but bottle and bond has its own page. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, it must be pretty damn important if that's it. And then people started asking questions about prohibition, and I looked back, and the only whiskey you could really get legally was bottle and bond. And then before that, the bottle and bond, I didn't realize the Bottle and Bond Act had been around since 1897. It was the first consumer protection legislation in the history of the United States. So all that together went, that's how I'm going to get a reputation. I'm going to talk about words on labels, but no one was talking about back then. I'm not the first person to ever talk about words on labels. Pappy Van Winkle would take out ads. I learned that by reading books, and that he would take out ads in the newspaper with all the different definitions. And he was teaching people back. I'm like, well, hell, that's cool. Nobody's talking about it. So we need to do it again, right?
Right.
And, nothing's new. So, but I can recognize, and if I'm interested in it, maybe other people will be interested in it. And then also, I came from the comedy world. I was a stand-up comedian for 20 years before I got into this. So as an entertainer, somebody who knows how to read a crowd and all that, I'm like, hey, man, I was getting these decks, these PowerPoint presentations to help me give my presentations and tastings. And it was like, how do you make whiskey? You grind the grain, you cook the grain. They were giving temperatures out for fermentation, and when I'm like, well, shit, I just assumed you did all this shit right. I don't, as a audience member, I don't really want to hear about that. I want to hear those stories that Fred tells, and he talked about Booker Noe and his daddy and the people he grew up with, Uncle Carl Beam and Jerry Beam, who invented the jerry hoist that lifts the barrels up in the rick house. And he talked about that rick house, and Booker standing in the rick house and feeling the temperature. And that was his science, was feeling it with his body and all that. And I'm like, ooh, I saw how people resonated with that. And of course, Fred was always talking about Jim Beam and Knob Creek and all that. And there was no bottle and bond. I'm like, I'm going to talk about bottle and bond. That's gonna make me different. If I talk about words on labels and talk about this bottle and bond thing, and I'm going to learn more as much as I can. And then I'll never forget, in 2008, I was sitting in my home bar, different home bar, but a similar bar. And I was with a couple friends, and they're like, how are things going? And I'm like, it's going just real good. And I'm trying to, and I had been hired to be an ambassador then for Knob Creek in the small batch. And they go, hey, it's a great job you got. And it's real fun. I said, I'm having a blast and it's a lot of fun. I said, and then of course the whiskey was talking too. Sometimes you get the loudmouth soup starts talking. And I looked at my friends and I said, you know what I'm going to do? And I said, I'm going to bring Bottle and Bond back.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be my goal and my quest. That's going to be my sword in the stone, right? I'm just going to be the Bottle and Bond guy. I went out and I got a tattoo of bonded, and there's no brand on it, right. But I wanted to walk the walk and talk the talk, and I wanted to be the Bottle and Bond guy. And I was like, I'm going to bring this back. And I knew I was really onto something when a lot of people in the company were like, why are you talking about Bottle and Bond? Those brands don't sell much. They're never going to sell much. You can only use whiskey from one season, so it's not going to be a million case brand ever, And I'm like, oh, now I definitely want to talk about it, right? It's the little underdog. It's the whiskey, And then why won't it? And I said, oh yeah, you're right. You can only use barrels that you made in one distilling season, a 6-month period. Then I was more. That didn't discourage me. That encouraged me. I'm like, oh, now I want to fight for this little guy. How come nobody wants to fight for little old granddad, right? How come nobody wants to fight? How come we didn't have a Bottle and Bond Old Overholt back then? How come Old Crow wasn't Bottle and Bond? How come there's not a Jim Beam Bottle and Bond? Why? Oh, they just don't sell. We don't talk about that. We don't want you talking about that. And it just made me want to do it more.
Right.
Because, whatever. And they weren't wrong for what they were thinking, because they're thinking in a much bigger picture and in a much bigger business picture, But, I found that I could talk about what they wanted me to talk about, and then I could slip in this, my message. And if nothing else, it would establish me in the industry,
sure,
whether it affected the brands or not. And I needed that affirmation, not for myself, but I needed, because I wasn't Jim Beam's great grandson. I wasn't, I had to be somebody, I had to make something of my, be with something of myself. And that takes years and years to do. And that's what I was willing to do. And then when I left Jim Beam, they had reorganized a couple times and my job title changed, and I wasn't an ambassador anymore. I was doing internal education for the sales team. And I wasn't looking for a job, but when Heaven Hill called me and asked me if I would like to come over and talk to them about being an ambassador, and that's all they wanted me to do. And I was supposed to be a brand educator and then also be an ambassador for Jim Beam. And I was like, well, that's 2 or 3 jobs at once. And I'm like, so anyway, I was vulnerable. And then I went over to Heaven Hill, and it was like, whoa, they have a dozen Bottle and Bonds.
Right.
And it seems like they don't mind me talking about Little Mellow Corn and Little J.W. Dent and JTS Brown and all these little brands and Rittenhouse Rye, which was really putting them on the map with bars and cocktail places. So I'm like, ooh. So I said, is it okay to talk about these? And they're like, well, yeah. I mean, we'd love you. You're the whiskey ambassador. So that's whiskey is, and all that. And they make every style of American whiskey, and that's one of their mission statements. So they were fine with it. And we're family owned. So talking to Max and the family, and I'm like, I like Bottle and Bond. They go, that's one reason why we loved you. We got Bottle and Bond. And I'm like, well, I know these brands don't sell much. And they go, look, we want every barrel to sell. We want our core brands to grow, but we got to sell every, it does the company good if you sell everything. So, and then I started using them as educational tools more since I moved in over here. And since we have so many Bottle and Bonds, I mean, it's just been a great ride. And then all of a sudden people are, and I'm talking about it all the time. And there's a thing here called Camp Run Amok in Kentucky where 150 to 200 bartenders come in twice a year. And we get to do my Bourbon through Bluegrass in front of them. And I champion Bottle and Bond. So, I've these bartenders that go out who get excited about Bottle and Bond. And of course they liked it anyway because of the 100 proof and making cocktails.
Great cocktail. Yeah.
Yeah. So they were kind of already on board. And then when they started learning the history of it and how important it was, then I had lots of Bottle and Bond ambassadors going out in the world. And I think about, I really noticed it about 2-3 years ago. I don't know, when did you notice that people were really starting to really understand what Bottle and Bond was? And if they didn't know any more than it was 100 proof and it had more regulations, that it was important. When did you see it, Randy?
I would say it was probably about 2.5 years ago is when I started noticing. Mm-hmm. But I mean, your effort has changed the industry. I mean, I think I heard a statistic once that before you started championing Bottled and Bond, there were like 7 or 8 Bottled and Bond whiskeys available or something like that. And now there's, I don't know. How many.
Heaven Hill had almost a dozen themselves, but the industry only had less than 20.
Yeah. And now
only about 16. Now still it's not a huge number. But, so I mentioned there's 1,800 craft distillers. Mm-hmm. There's 10 major distilleries still making 95% of the world's bourbon. Still, the pie got bigger, so it wasn't like whatever. But so let's just say everybody makes 2 brands. Of course, we make about 50 or 70 brands.
Right.
So but let's just say everybody makes 2. That's about over 3,000 brands of American whiskey on the marketplace today. Of over 3,000 brands, there's less than 40 Bottle and Bonds.
Okay.
And in any given market, there's less than 20 because, some are control states and some don't bring in. Some of these little brands like JTS Brown or JW Dan, they're not national. They're just in about 6 markets.
Right.
But Jim Beam has come out and made Old Overholt Bottle and Bond again. They brought out Jim Beam in a Bottle and Bond. Then they dropped it, right? They recently dropped it, but they came out with Old Tub, mm-hmm. instead. And you're finding that it was Wilderness Trail when I really got excited. Dr. Heist over there and with the folks at Wilderness Trail, they didn't come out with a product until 4 years, and they could make it Bottle and Bond. So their initial product offering was Bottle and Bond. And I think that took so much notice that now craft distillers are looking at coming out with Bottle and Bond to make their craft distillery, even though it's young, legitimate, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So you have New Riff, who's doing the same, they have more, but they have several Bottle and Bonds and that. So it is a way for a craft distiller to go, look, we're just not going to sell $50 bottles of 6-month-old whiskey.
Right. We have
real Bottled and Bond. That's how good, that's how we are. So I got real excited when that started happening. And then I came out with a few programs and now that people are recognizing, I can even do more with folks,
Sure. So let's go through quickly what the elements of a Bottled and Bond whiskey are. What are the requirements to be Bottled and Bond?
Well, I'm going to make Jerry Dalton happy, and I'm just going to read from the standards of identity, right?
That will work.
Because there you go. I mean, I love doing that because sometimes, I'll do it, because I know the laws all the time. I talk about them all the time. But sometimes it's good to go back and look because some things will jump out at you when the more you know. So, sometimes it's fun to go back and reread whiskey books that I read 10 years ago. I'm reading them through different eyes right now.
Sure.
And I get more information now than I got out the time before. So anyway, so the words bond, here's a question I get all the time. Does it have to say bond? Or what if it just says bottle, but does it have to say bottle and bond? What if it just says bonded? Okay? So here's that. The words bond, bonded, bottle and bond, or aged in bond, or phrases containing these are synonymous terms. I guess if you had James Bond, right? Shall not be used on any part of the brand name of a domestic distilled spirits. So right there we learn 2 things. Anything around bond, bonded, bottle and bond, so that's legal. And then domestic distilled spirits. So it doesn't pertain to whiskey. It pertains to domestically distilled spirits. So anything made in the United States, because we can only control what we can do here in the United States. We can't control other countries.
Sure.
And we've proved over the last few years we can't even control ourselves. Right?
Amen.
So it must be composed of the same kind of spirits produced from the same class of materials. So that means this is a class of spirit. This is a rye whiskey. Mm-hmm. This is a class of spirit, a corn whiskey. And this is a class of spirit, a bourbon whiskey. Mm-hmm. So I can't mingle those together. Even though they're the same grains, they're different whiskeys.
Right.
So that's that cuts you down, way down, right? So if I run short on something, I just can't, whatever. I mean, it has to stand on its own.
Right.
So that's really neat. Produced in the same distilling season by the same distiller at the same distillery. So a distilling season is defined by the United States government as spring and fall. Mm-hmm. So on our old Fitzgerald bottle and bonds here, there is it says spring or fall. Mm-hmm. Spring is barrels that were filled January through June 30th. And fall is July 1st through December 31st. So I can't mingle those two. So right. if I run out, I got to wait, right? Kind of explains to me why Knob Creek was never bottle and bond. It's 100 proof, it's 9 years old, it's from the same distillery. How come? Well, it's a million case brand. So they don't have enough from one distilling season, and they might go short. And that's the last thing you want business-wise, is to have a shortage on the shelf. Then people panic. They start buying, they start buying more because, oh my God, they stopped or whatever they do, So you don't want the facings to come off the shelf. So the laws start to explain, that's how tough bottle and bond is. Even though they meet every requalification, they don't meet that one, right?
Right.
And then stored for at least 4 years. So now a bottle and bond is an age statement, just like the word straight. Straight means it must be aged for 2 years in the appropriate types of containers. This is 4. So when I see bottle and bond, I'm guaranteed a minimum age of 4 years. It's pretty cool. Think about 1897 when this came out, how important this was.
Sure.
In wooden containers, so it doesn't say the kind of containers because that's defined in the word corn here or the word rye here.
Right.
So that's already been defined.
Right.
So this has to be a used charred container. That has to be a brand new charred container. So there's no reason they're going to go back over it because we could use other spirits too, remember?
Well, what's ironic, though, is at the time that this was written, I don't think that the types of containers were legally defined for bourbon and corn whiskey and all that. So it just speaks to how brilliant the authors of this legislation were to have it so narrowly defined, yet open enough for the distillers to still be able to produce the types of spirits that they wanted. I just find that very interesting.
And I don't know if that was worded that way back then, because these did go away in Prohibition.
Oh, okay. So this may be a rewrite.
And then they were brought back and they were rewritten in 1936 and then in 1938 and 1964.
Gotcha.
So these are the updated laws, but they did, and they did address a bonding period, which was not aging. That was how they paid taxes, and that was the benefit of how this came through.
Right.
Was usually you pay taxes as it came off the still. So you had to pay for the angel share, and you had to pay taxes on it, immediately. So the quicker you could get it out to sell, the better it was. Well, this was a way to put it on the shelf and say, I'm not going to have to pay taxes on this for 4, 6, or 8 years.
Right.
That was a bonding period, which is different than bottle and bond. But anyway, I digress. But that's how this all came around, because it was a benefit to the distillery on top of it. Okay?
Right.
So stored for at least 4 years in wooden containers where the spirits have been in contact with the wood surface, except for gin and vodka. Whoa. So this is why I'm reading this, because I want you to hear the true story. Have you ever tasted a bottle and bond gin or vodka or seen one?
No.
No. Here's why. Because it must be stored for at least 4 years in wooden containers, coated or lined with paraffin or other substances which will preclude the contact of spirits with the wood. And I got to think that that's the whiskey producers going, well, shit, if we got to wait 4 years, they got to wait 4 years too.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. Because, it's not going to change the flavor of them, but they got to wait, So I think that's hilarious. And we actually looked into making some gin and vodka bottle and bond, because we got barrels and paraffin's not expensive, but you'd have to dismantle the barrel, coat it, manually put it back together. It was just going to be too much cost, labor cost to do it. But it's just an interesting fact. Then reduced and improved by the addition of pure water only. So again, imagine back in 1897, they were putting in battery acid, they were putting in tobacco spit, different juices and flavors and colors to make it look like whiskey. So this says all you can add is pure water, and you can only take it the reduction in proof down to 100.
Right.
So back then you couldn't put it in the barrel over 110 proof. And so that's not much give there.
Right.
So when you see the 101, 103, and 107s, those are the barrel proofs of the day.
Right.
People don't look at it that way, but that's where those came from.
Mm-hmm.
And so this has to be exactly 100, which is a proof gallon, which is how we pay taxes. So that all makes sense, right? This is a government thing, and all they really care about is money, right?
Right.
Then, in addition to the requirements, the label shall bear the real name of the distillery or the trade name in which the distillery produced and warehoused the spirits, and the plant registered number, which is the DSP, the Distilled Spirits Plant Number. And everybody is assigned a number because that's where the taxes are levied. So in the case of Heaven Hill, that's DSP KY1. So by law, we have to put that on there.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a Elijah Craig or an Evan Williams or Jim Beam or Woodford Reserve, they're not bottle and bond, so you don't have to put that on there.
Right.
So, that bottle and bond, imagine today when you have a lot of people sourcing whiskeys.
Sure.
Which is fine. It could come from us, right? So it can be fine, but they might buy some from, Distillery A, some from Distillery B, mingle them together, do that. Well, here you can't do that with bottle and bond. It has to come from one distillery, right? You have to put the trade name. Sometimes, even if they bottle it 100 proof, like David Nicholson, which used to be bottle and bond until I turned them in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they didn't produce that.
Mm-hmm.
And they sourced it, and they can't tell where they got it by a contract. But they wanted to make it look like, so they put down the DSP KY16 because that's where the brand came from. Well, that's Old Stitzel-Weller. Well, that's not right. That's misleading the customer. And a lot of people are going, oh my God, did you see that Stitzel-Weller distillate? It's in David Nicholson. Well, wait a minute. No. So, we're friends with the Luxco, but we're like, hey, you can't do that. You got to stop doing that. And they're like, oh shit, we didn't even think about that. That's how much people didn't think about bottle and bond back then.
Right.
Yeah. I remember when Jim Beam bottle and bond came out. Jim Beam bottle and bond. I think I have a bottle. I got a bottle around here somewhere. But when it originally came out, it said one distillery, one distilling season, which I thought was great. They have it right, like teaching people on a label, but then they didn't put the DSP down. They listed Frankfurt and Claremont. Well, that's two distilleries. You just said one distillery, and now you're listing two.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how much sometimes how marketing and truth,
right.
And they weren't trying to mislead anybody. They were trying to do what they did, right? But
right.
I turned them in, right? Because I feel like I'm the bottle and bond police, right?
Right.
And these are hard to achieve. And if we're achieving them, you can be in this, and we need a lot more people to be bottle and bond. We want more people to be bottle and bond, but you got to be correct.
Right.
If you want to swim in this pond, you gotta follow all the rules. So, so that's how I quickly describe bottle and bond is these words on labels are like military men and women earning medals.
Mm-hmm.
You gotta earn the whiskey medal.
Yeah.
So you gotta be whiskey first. Whiskey's over here, the small word. So you gotta earn that word. That means it has to come from grain. It has to be distilled up to 190 proof. It has to be aged in oak. Bourbon has to be at least 51% corn, so and then rye has to be 51% rye. Mm-hmm. Corn whiskey is at least 80% corn, so you got to earn the corn medal or the rye medal. This has to be distilled no more than 160 proof into a brand new charred barrel, no more than 125. This has to be a used charred barrel, no more than 125, and produce a less than 160. So you got to earn all those metals. Then you would earn the straight metal, which means it has to be aged for a minimum of 2 years and nothing but pure water added. And then you got to earn the Kentucky metal, or if it's made in some other state, you know, that metal. And then you can put it on there. Kentucky has a further rule saying it has to be aged for a year and a day to call it Kentucky.
Okay.
So that means that we're paying taxes on that. So they're going to get their piece too.
Sure.
So if you want to put Kentucky on it, not only do you make it there, you got to age it here for a year and a day.
Okay.
And then, so that earns those metals. But if it says bottled and bond on it, you got to meet all of these. So that's why I call them the Green Beret of spirits. It has all the metals. You know, I remember that was one of the first movies I remember going to see at the theater. I went to the Vogue Theater in St. Matthews here. You know, the standalone theater, right? And you went to a theater and you saw a movie. They only had one movie going, right? And it was John Wayne's Green Beret. And Sergeant Barry Sadler sang the title song. And it said, it was a real Green Beret sergeant that sang it. And it says, put silver wings on my son's chest, make him one of America's best. 100 men will test today, but only 3 of the Green Beret. So out of 100 people that try to be a Green Beret, only 3 make it. Well, that's why I call it, because there's 3,000 brands of American whiskey and there's less than 40 bottle and bonds. So they're my Green Beret, right? So that's why I get so excited. And then when you tell people things like that, all of a sudden, hopefully that sparks something in them that they want to learn more about it. But, you know, some people get into collecting and getting these allocated items, these unicorns and stuff. And I know a lot of people will say, well, I've never seen mellow corn. I mean, I've never seen it. I said, well, you're looking up all the time. Sometimes you got to look down. Right? And there's a lot of gems down there, you know, not just from our distillery, but, you know, there's very old Barton bottle and bond. You know, right. There's a Kentucky Tavern had a bottle and bond for a while. The Old Granddad, of course. But, you know, JTS Brown and JW Dant and all those are on the bottom shelf, mellow corn. And, you know, I tell people you should, you know, you're always looking for gold dust. And you should always grab gold dust because sometimes it's there and then it's gone. So it's not going to be there. I said, but you're stepping on bricks of gold to grab gold dust.
Right.
And that's fine. But don't forget to pick the brick up and put that in your cart too. Yeah. Because you don't know when those are going to go away. Because, you know, because they're so specific, and we have other brands like, our Evan Williams, regular Evan Williams is the number 2 selling bourbon in the world. It's up 50%. Wow. Since March. That's a 2 million case brand. We're shipping 30,000 more cases a month. Well, that's one specific year. Do you think we made 50% more whiskey 5 years ago for that one brand? Nope. No. So sometimes you got to make difficult decisions, and you got to rob Peter to pay Paul, right? Right. So we have some brands that we can take from, and you hope that they never disappear totally off the shelf. But sometimes we can steal a little bit from here, or you know, they say rob Peter and pay Paul. But my friend Rob, he always says, yeah, but you always want to be Paul in that situation. You don't want to be Peter. Right. Because Paul's going to get paid, right? Right. Yeah. I like that. So that's the cool thing, you know, and we are in the whiskey business, so we can't go back in the time machine and make more stuff. So, you know. One of the things that I find interesting is Colonel E.H. Taylor was involved in the original legislation, right? Several were. You had E.H. Taylor, and I've read that Ezra Brooks was also involved. With him. You also had people who didn't want him, and I.W. Bernheim was one of those people. Really? Who founded the story where we are. He's not associated with our company. But, you know, you can imagine, I want the government to be more involved in my business and tell me what to do. This would not be a popular thing, right? Well, but because it was popular with some, because the way that I've always tried to describe it to people is, you know, around 1900, this legislation originally came out in 1897. The Temperance Movement had already started, and about 20 years. Yeah. So part of
the momentum in the temperance movement was the fact that consumers couldn't count on what they were consuming, what they were buying, what was going to be in that bottle. And and this legislation not only helped the government collect their taxes, but it also was there to protect consumers from substandard products. And so talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, like I said, back, the country was growing west, and there was two things happening all at the same time there. And then you had people who were just taking neutral grain spirits, like, remember that first high school party you went to and somebody had a bottle of Everclear? And that's 190 proof, just pure grain alcohol. And of course, then you dump it into a punch bowl. And, what did you all add? We added like high C punch, right? And then that made it sweet and cut the proof way down. And then we put in other things. We put in like pieces of fruit, right? Mm-hmm. We put in, more water just to water it down, and it made it go further and able to drink. Well, that's kind of what they were doing. They were just they could make rye whiskey or bourbon whiskey if they just changed ingredients a little bit. If they put a little more battery acid in, or if they, put a little more coffee or prune juice or cherry juice to sweeten it up, and then they slap a whiskey label on it and say it's whiskey. Well, hell, if you're Dr. James Crow or Colonel Taylor and your whiskey's straight whiskey, which comes the term they were using, it came straight from the barrel, so it was not unaltered. There were no legal terms or anything. That was just what they called it. Mm-hmm. And then those people were making compound whiskey or imitation whiskey. Mm-hmm. So the folks like E.H. Taylor and Ezra Brooks and different folks and I.W. Harper, they were more proud of their whiskey because they said, hey, look, we're making straight whiskey. We're not doing that imitation shit, right? Mm-hmm. That's for the other people. And then the other thing that was happening, why this law really came to be, there was a whiskey trust. So in 1897, it was okay to have a monopoly. There was no antitrust laws yet. So there was a group in Peoria, Illinois, and which is ironically where Archer Daniel Midlands is today. That was still one of the largest distillers in the world, but that's the home of that. And there's a man named Sherman, I believe. But anyway, they were trying to corner the whiskey market and make monopoly. So they would come to the different little distilleries and they'd say, we want you to be part of the trust. And some of them said, sure. And they still got to run their distillery, but sometimes their distilleries were shut down because they had a huge distillery in Illinois. So we're just going to make everything out of here. Right? And if you didn't join it, sometimes they would put dynamite charges and different things in your distillery to try to coerce you, using mafia tactics to get you to join the whiskey trust. At one point, they controlled 80% of the whiskey market.
Wow.
But they couldn't get to because of location-wise too, where the distilleries in Kentucky, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, and New York, which they made more rye up there, and we made more bourbon where we were. Mm-hmm. So we also had we had a Kentucky Distillers Association and things like that. So they couldn't get a foothold with us. But it was that's that compound whiskey market, think of brands like Seagram 7 or Kessler, things like that. They're still around today. That's the kind of stuff, you could make it cheaper and you can charge less for it. And there was much more sales of that than there was bourbon and all that kind of stuff. So that it did win the day, and to those distillers' help. And I think that if I.W. Bernheim was around today, he'd be going, that was a good thing to do. I didn't like it at first, but I think that's the way to go. And it did set a quality standard, and it was not any more expensive to the United States government, which was a big thing. Because now you're going to have these agents, but the agents were already there. From the end of the Civil War, there was a tax levied on whiskey. So they had agents already living on the distillery properties. They lived there. When you go to Jim Beam and the visitor center and the Beam House on top of the hill there where Fred No's offices, that's where they stayed. That was the house. That's why that house was there. That's where those gaugers lived. And so because those agents were already there and it was not going to cost any more money, and the Secretary of Treasury is where that comes under, and that was John Carlisle. And John Carlisle was from Covington, Kentucky. So he understood the whiskey business and the bourbon business, and I guess he thought that would be something good for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And that's whose picture that is. That's John Carlisle's picture in the tax stamp. So we keep that there for that history, because he was always on and then the tax stamp for bottle and bond is always green, and then the tax stamp for anything that's not bottle and bond is red.
Okay.
So you could go to a liquor store and just look through, and so you see the green one, and you know that's bottle and bond, and the red. I might have one that has the red on it. Yeah, I do. Hold on. So here is an example of a non-bottle and bond tax stamp. It's red. Mm-hmm. This is on an old Weller from the 70s.
Yeah, I saw a guy finish one of those off with his dad, and they had found it in his grandfather's house. Finished it off over the holiday, so that's pretty cool.
That's real. Everybody always asks, "Hey, I got a bottle from Prohibition or whatever, or something that's real old. How much can I make from this?" I said, "You know what you should do? You should find your dad or your grandfather or your kids or something, and you should open that and enjoy it. What's $300?
Exactly.
You can't buy that memory. So."
Thank you for tuning in to part 1 of Bottle and Bond with Bernie Lubbers. I hope that you enjoyed this program, and if you did, I would like it if you would subscribe and tune in next week for part 2. In part 2, we'll discuss drinking philosophy, the quote-unquote know-it-all teenagers from the whiskey enthusiast world that like to tell everybody how wrong they are. We talk about the program that Bernie created called the Certified Bonded Premises, where bars, restaurants, and now retail stores can get certified for carrying bottled and bond products. We talk about Laird's Apple Brandy, which is the only bottled and bond apple brandy that was created by Bernie with his employer, Heaven Hill. We talk about some memorable whiskey experiences that he's had, which, as you can imagine, would be amazing for somebody who travels globally as a brand ambassador. We talk about the difficulties of being a brand ambassador and the difficulties of trying to maintain your health when you drink for a living. So anyway, I hope that you tune in next week. We'll see you then. Bye-bye. This content is being brought to you by the Bourbon Real Talk American Whiskey Aroma Kit. This is a tool that I put together to help all you whiskey aficionados out there develop your palates. You can sit down with the vials and train your senses, or you can sit down with a great dram and break that whiskey down to its components. If you have any interest of purchasing a kit of your own, head on over to bourbonrealtalk.com/shop and pick one up. Thank you for listening.